So we've hinted at him, and we're going to transition now to the other guy who committed, and that's Jalil Bethea. Jalil Bethea is a guy who just absolutely phenomenal basketball player. Um, Alabama recruited him very, very heavily coming out of high school last season. He was a top 10 recruit, consensus top 10 recruit. I know On3 had him as, I believe, the number 7 player overall. He was, above guys like Liam McNeely, above guys like Con Knipple. He was a top 3-point shooter coming out of that class. He is a guy that, was rated around Trey Johnson, right? When you look at all the freshmen that had a huge impact and that have entered into the NBA draft for this past season, he was on that tier. Obviously, there's a couple of things that, hurt him. None bigger than having your coach retire and be gone at the beginning of the season, right? With Larinaga gone, Miami was kind of a dumpster fire this year. It not only his fault, right? You can't say that it's his fault. There is a situation issue, right? When you have a coach leave and depart in the way that it did, it was just a situation where it was not the best fit for him. This is somebody that Alabama knows will be a great fit in our system, right? When you look at what he did on the EYBL circuit and what he did in the AAU circuit, he was an elite, over 40% 3-point guy. He was over an 80% free throw shooter. Inside the arc from 2, he was like 58%, right? Think about a similar shooter to like what Nate talked about from an Aiden Holloway perspective, right? No matter what you saw on the court that freshman year, you knew what you saw when you were recruiting him. You knew what you saw from an EYBL. And that's somebody that you have to think about when you're looking at a guy like Bethea, right? He's a 6'5" guard that can pass, dribble, and shoot. Was one of the best 3-point shooters and best shooters just overall in that entire class, right? And there's a ton of elite shooters that were in that class. So that speaks very highly to how good Bethea is. He's a guy that, in my opinion, if he was in our system last season, probably is a one and done, right? If he had a better circumstance than his coach leaving at Miami, right, I think he's a one and done. I'm not just saying that to Alabama's system. I think if he was in a better system, he probably would have been a one and done because he is the prototype of what the NBA is looking for, right? A 6'5" guy, a good guard that can shoot, that can kind of create on his own. That has, the ability to be a good defender, right? His offensive game is a bit ahead of his defensive game, at least today, but, is somebody that can be a good defender in time, but a guy that's just elite with the basketball and elite shooting the basketball. It's obviously somebody that's a perfect fit for Alabama's system, right? When you look at who Alabama's recruiting and who the NBA would be looking for, both of these guys are perfect examples, right? Bull Bowen and Bethea, both guys that make sense that if they have NBA aspirations, their body and their stereotype for what they are is absolutely perfect, right? And when you look at who Nate Oates recruits, he's looking for NBA athletes, right? He's looking for NBA players. That is a huge piece of how Alabama constructs its roster because of the system we play, right? We've talked about how some NBA systems even talk about Alabama as like, oh, this 31st NBA team, right? It's a team that builds itself like the NBA roster from an analytics perspective, from the way that they run practice, from the way they do everything, right? Alabama tries to run it in an NBA style, right? So when you see the guys that Alabama's going after, that NBA potential is something that is going to be there with guy and guy and guy again, right? So that's something that I fully expect to see in Bethea as you continue to hear more names that Alabama is in the running for. Like, for example, Cedric Coward. We'll talk about him later. But a guy that Alabama, is in the final 2 for between Alabama and Duke, but also going through the NBA draft process. That's what Alabama's looking for, right? Guys that are looking to get to the league. We saw that with Grant Nelson. You see that with guys over and over and over again. That is the prototype for who Nate Oates is looking for. Somebody that can be successful in our system and also somebody that has those aspirations to get to the NBA because at the end of the day, our systems are very, very similar, right? Bethea is a guy that I think that the shooting numbers, right, when we talk about Bulbo, when we talked about how good he was shooting last season, and you could say, hey, he was an elite shooter last season, number 1 in the ACC from three, in conference play. Bethea's not a guy whose numbers last season are going to pop off the screen at you. He averaged just 7 points a game. He shot 35% from three in conference play. Not bad, not elite, but not a bad shooter. 32% from three in for the full season. He only took 92 attempts. I fully expect that to be his least amount of attempts for as long as he stays at Alabama. If you look at who Alabama and the number of attempts that some of our guys have, I would fully expect that attempt number to, get up into the 4 to 5 a game range. 130 plus would be my expectation of a guy like Bethea. Would not shock me if that number got even a little higher, right? Nate Oates is a team that is not afraid to shoot the basketball, especially if you're open, right? And Bethea's one of his best attributes was off the catch, right? His ability to shoot off the catch. And right, when you talk about that, it's similar to it's similar to an Aiden Holloway, right? The numbers are not going to pop off the screen at you from what you saw in their freshman season, but you know how good they are and you know that your system is a perfect fit for them, right? So that's the kind of prototype of what you're looking at. Another McDonald's All-American, another guy that obviously has the skill set and has the potential, and now you're just pairing him with the coaching and with the system to be able to unlock what he's able to do, right? That's what my expectation is out of a guy like Bethea. I fully expect him to be a starter again, like we talked about. Bobo and Bethea, I think, will both be starters this season. I think that, Alabama is getting more and more guys that are fitting their skill set, right? You have some of the guys that Alabama is bringing in from a freshman class, obviously the returning players, and then the transfers that have already committed to Alabama. You're starting to see how this next season's team is going to shape up, and I really like what I'm seeing, right? Spoiler alert, I really like what I'm seeing out of Alabama basketball. I do think that Alabama still has a few guys that they're on the look for, right? A head guard is something they're looking for, or a guard that can, have some lead guard attributes. I don't know if they're specifically looking for a, number one point guard. They're looking for guards that can all pass, dribble, and shoot, but they have one of those, right? Latrell Wrightsville is going to be one of those. Aiden Holloway is going to be one of those. Houston Millette's already one of those, right? The guys who you're bringing in and returning are all going to be some of those, but obviously you're still on the lookout for some additional ones currently, right? So we're going to continue talking about the guys that have already committed to Alabama. There's going to be another episode. I may talk about football next week and then talk about basketball the week after that, or vice versa. I'm not fully decided on the actual rollout of these episodes, but I, of course, will talk about some of the new guys as they continue to commit.